A lot of people went to boot camps, schools, paid a lot of money, are just having a really hard time being found.
There are jobs out there. This competition is high. What are you doing to set yourself apart?
I've been a manager over 10 years in the tech industry. I've done over 1,000 interviews, hired over 100 people. I've been through it a lot. There's definitely some pain.
Actually, Amazon, for example, recommends having 10 to 15 stories. These are incidents from your experience that speak to potentially multiple different interview questions.
Welcome to our webinar on getting your first job in tech. The focus today is on folks in their early journey in tech, but I believe experienced folks are going to get a lot out of it, especially those entering the job market after a long time. So first up, George Andros, ex-Apple, ex-Amazon, QA, DevOps, you name it, he's done it all. If you have questions about interviewing, he's the go-to person, but in his spare time, he also loves to talk about the great outdoors and cycling. So next up, we have Ken Fury, product leader, held every single title there is in the product world, entrepreneur as well. He is my go-to if I need anything, if I want to know what's going on in big tech companies all the way down to startups. So thank you, Ken, for joining the party today. And last but not least, Eugene Polonsky, engineering manager at Amazon, IMDb, Adobe, ex-Microsoft, ex-Apple. So much to say about him, but let's hear directly from him as to getting your first job in tech.
Thank you so much, Adil. On our agenda today, we'll talk about why the tech market is the way it is right now, what's creating all this difficulty. We'll talk about different approaches to getting that interview, how you can even go an interview, essentially. We'll talk about ways of preparing for an interview, and we'll also provide some hints about how to pass the interview. And then finally, we'll talk about a program that we are actually putting together to help streamline this whole process. First problem, no interviews. This is what we hear from our clients over and over again. Like, resume reviews are important, they're great. Interview coaching is wonderful, but can't even get interviews. You're sending resumes one after another for months at a time, and nothing, just ghosting. So the question is why? The first problem is the resume screening tools. It's the applicant tracking system. And essentially, I think many of you probably know about this. It weeds out the majority of resumes that are sent for a particular rec before the resume even gets to a human. It's looking for basically keyword matches on your resume against the job description. And there are a lot of tools that kind of can help with that. The second problem is that we all know, especially larger companies have laid off thousands and thousands of people. So the market is essentially flooded with more senior, more capable talent that's making it very difficult to stand out. Ineffective application methods is another big reason. So we've all been taught over our decades of experience you see an application, you apply for the job, you send in your resume, you wait for a recruiter to contact you. And that's just not working anymore. Like, that way of applying is just no longer relevant. Finally, recruiting has also suffered a lot of layoffs. If you talk to recruiters in the industry, they'll tell you that a huge percentage of their coworkers have been laid off. So what that has meant is, especially for larger companies, if there are recs that are being open and there are less recruiters to service those recs, it means the candidate experience drops. It means recruiters just don't have the time to devote the kind of attention to candidates that they used to. That's where a lot of the ghosting is coming from. There's just not enough recruiters to go around. And of course, all of this is exacerbated even worse for early career candidates, like folks who are bootcamp grads or career switchers or fresh college grads. Because as a hiring manager, there is a very simple calculus here. I could take a chance on a newer graduate or an earlier career person and hope that they wind up being the diamond in the rough and pay them a little bit less. Or I could take an experienced person, one of the many that we've discussed have been laid off, and pay them a little bit more, but at least they're proven. I know what I'm getting. So for hiring managers, unfortunately, it's a no-brainer. Then that's what's making it so difficult for early career candidates to break in. So I'd like to open this up to the panel now. What are you guys seeing? What else are your thoughts? Maybe Ken, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. It's a kind of a deadlock going on out there where there are far too many candidates. Every hiring manager is absolutely flooded. There's an average of 150 applicants per job. And you can imagine for the more attractive jobs that actually let you work remotely, the number is much higher. I'm hearing horror stories like that from a lot of colleagues at various companies, particularly companies whose names. It's a very difficult situation for the hiring manager as well as for all the applicants. So I think it requires a different strategy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But any thoughts, George?
Yeah, I hear from a lot of people who went to boot camps, schools, paid a lot of money, spent a lot of time, and are just having a really hard time being found. Even just getting recognized by recruiters is one thing, and then getting past interviews with very high competition. It's really rough out there, and there's just one story after another. My heart really goes out because a couple of years ago, this was not an issue. You graduate with a CS degree, you're almost guaranteed not just a good job, a great job. And even smaller companies were competing for candidates. The market's really turned. I'm hoping this is just temporary, but it's becoming harder and harder to weather the storm the longer the storm goes on.
There is a silver lining to all of that. There are jobs out there. Competition is high. What are you doing to set yourself apart, set yourself up?
Let me carry on into some thoughts about how to do better as a candidate. And that's the whole point, is standing out. There's a whole universe where when you apply for a job, you're now applying against many people out in the world, and there's not a lot of local requirement. Since COVID, things have changed up significantly. So how do you actually be the one that gets noticed? That's really the trick, and that may be the way that you can help to shortcut yourself through the line. One of the key ways is to actually contribute to open source. It's actually critical. There's a lot of hiring managers who pay attention, especially if it happens to be in a technical function area that's adjacent to the things they do. So yeah, pick somebody who you think you'd like to work with and see what they're interested and excited about it. Most of them are socially aware, technically aware, and they'll notice when things are occurring around them, where some person comes out of nowhere and drops some pretty interesting code into open source. Volunteering and freelancing, like using something like Upwork, anything you can do to gain experience that goes just beyond, hey, I got a degree or I graduated a boot camp, being able to actually point at, here's something I built, and they get permission to actually share that too is critical. That actually puts you above a significant percentage of the candidate. My favorite, networking. I hate networking. But I have to admit, it works. If you know somebody at a company and that company has a job opening, even though the person's not the hiring manager, and I've done this a few times, reach out and say, hey, if you're going to get a referral bonus, why don't you refer me? And I promise not to embarrass you. And it's bypassing an entire enormous queue, hundreds of resumes and applications that have stacked up. Not enough HR to go through it and screen it all, but suddenly somebody they trust, somebody they currently work with, wanders over and drops this on their virtual desktop and says, hey, I've worked with this person in the past, and I can actually vouch for her. She's done a great job with the work that I've seen. There's no better way to actually get past the enormous queue of individuals. And networking goes beyond just using a reference. There's other ways to make yourself visible, such as personal projects. I like to write articles, and it's always amazing me when I apply for jobs or when I'm talking to somebody that people have read it. It doesn't have to be writing for you, but if you're actually going to go on a learning journey, you're going to learn how to code and React. Great. Get yourself a YouTube channel and document your learning journey, because that's interesting. It's a real story. It's a beginning and an ending. Here's where we started. Here are the struggles I had. A lot of people will actually find that to be fascinating, but don't double think any of this stuff. Take the chance and get your name out there. Be in front of that who have an opportunity to hire you. So guys, what do you think about?
Yeah, I think there was a good question from Alexei about do referrals still work in big tech? I think it depends on the type of referrals. For example, at Amazon, we have an internal site for referrals where I go, I fill out the candidate's name. I also indicate whether I've worked with the person or not, and any feedback that I might have if I have worked with the person. This latter type, where I have worked with the person, is going to be more effective, no question. If I'm simply referring somebody without any knowledge of their professional experience, then maybe not as much. But the best kind of referral is going to be, hey, I know there is a rec open in my sister team. Let me talk to the hiring manager and tell them about you. That type of referral is still as golden as it always has been.
Yeah, I'll chime in here as well. Referrals still work. I actually got a job through a referral, and it was a random referral. A lot of people are applying to a certain position. I reached out to someone who worked at the company in that team and on LinkedIn, and I was just very brief and honest. I said, you don't know me, but can I ask a favor? I sent them my resume. I said why I think I'm a good fit for the position. They referred me, and that's how I got noticed and got the position. I'd also say about networking, I don't think people do this enough, and it's not that hard, especially when you're just starting out in your career. I'd recommend reach out to a senior person doing the job you want to get, even if it's not at the company you want to work at or the one you're applying for, but just reach out to a very senior person and say, hi, I'm trying to break into this industry. Do you have 15 minutes? Can I buy you coffee? I'd love to hear from you about your experience and what it's like to do this job. And you'll be surprised. There's a lot of people who are in very senior positions who would love to give back, would love to give you the wisdom that they wish they had when they were in your position. And do this to several people. Not everyone's going to respond. The really great ones are really busy doing a great job at their work, but I promise you it's worth it. You'll make a friend. You'll learn a ton, and you'll get some networking. And it really doesn't hurt. It helps you the most to get that experience from someone who's been in your shoes, who's been in that path, and they're going to direct you in the right way to go. You utilize this. We're very, blessed to have something like LinkedIn where you've got access to that professional network. Definitely take advantage of that.
The other thing worth mentioning on the networking front is, guess what happens when you contribute to OSS? You network. And the reason why is every OSS project has its maintainers and has a core group of folks who are regularly contributing to it. So as soon as you begin to contribute on a regular basis, you are networking with those folks. And so you are very quickly growing your personal professional network amongst high visibility people. Like, assuming that you're contributing to high profile projects, which you should be, you're growing your visibility amongst a large crowd of folks.
Yeah, even just commenting on someone else's project or asking good questions will actually get you noticed, and it will help to elevate you.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit then about, let's say that you've been following our advice, and let's say that you're beginning to get some interview hints or some interview hits, invites to an interview. How do you actually prepare? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about interview preparation. So generally there are two types of interview questions: technical and behavioral, or also known as situational. So for technical questions, the internet is actually flooded with awesome prepare materials. Grind 75 and Educative's Grind 75 class are really good to get through the core set of types of problems that you're likely to be asked. There is a site called techinterviewhandbook.org, which is a great study resource for these Grind 75 problems as well. They walk you through the problems from easy to hard, and you just practice. Algo Expert is great for system design. So essentially they have a bunch of problems or sample problems like design Airbnb or design Prime Video, and they'll walk you exactly through how to approach this type of problem, exactly how to break it down, and how to come up with the final design. And then of course there's LeetCode, HackerRank, like all of those sites. I personally don't find them quite as useful as a more structured approach. I know a lot of folks do. For behavioral questions, and these are questions like, tell me about a time when you blah, 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 went above and beyond to deliver a project on time, or there's a huge amount of those kind of questions. Weekly webinars, we actually run weekly webinars Saturday mornings at 10 a.m., generally talking about those and doing mock interviews for folks. One-on-one coaching can also be really effective, but essentially it's practice. So what about you guys? Do you have other thoughts on ways to prepare?
I think on preparation, one kind of idea that stands out is usually, and this is the crowd where a lot of people are trying to break into the tech, or if you're focusing on junior position, is you have a leg up if you are doing these. If you're interviewing at a company that does have algorithms and other coding challenges, you have a leg up on folks who are perhaps more experienced, but who haven't done that. I'm not going to get into the right or wrong of those algorithm questions, those coding questions, but it is a way for companies to figure out who not to hire. So definitely follow on Eugene's advice.
You gain a lot when you do these things too. I went on Algo Expert because I've been interested in system design. As a product guy, it's not really going to overlap that much with the things I do, but all my career, I've been listening to technical conversations and discussions, arguments, and going through that course, it was really a light in a dark room. It was amazing how much of that stuff just became clear and made sense to me. And I can interview better now because of that, even if it's not specifically on system.
Tips and tricks. One thing, I was talking to Eugene just yesterday and looking at an article saying ChatGPT can solve 84% of lead code problems. And if you have these, and technical interviews come in different flavors, but if you have that, what are ways you differentiate yourself from AI? Because ultimately these companies want humans to work on their projects, not necessarily AI. So I'll come back to that theme and connect the dots there. Let's see here. I think the first and foremost really important part of any technical interview, whether it's a coding exercise or a system design interview or anything else in between, asking clarifying questions. So important. I'll give you a very good example of it. If you're you haven't flushed out all your constraints in your mind, you can take a lead code problem that might be easy and turn it into a hard, right? You miss that constraint about, hey, this is a sorted versus unsorted list, it can put you back. So really take your time, ask clarifying question, understand constraints. And you'll also see the theme. Think of it in terms of you're solving a problem with somebody else as opposed to just hunkering down and focusing on just solving the technical problem. Next up, thinking out loud. Again, this is something else that differentiates you from ChatGPT. You can put in a problem in ChatGPT and it can spill out a bunch of text. And I've actually spoken to somebody where that's happened to them, where they're interviewing somebody. They don't know. And then suddenly you have a solution and they can't really talk through it. So how do you approach this? You're talking through and explaining your reasoning why you're doing something, showing your problem-solving approach by having that conversation. I will say that thinking out loud is not something we all usually do at work. We don't do that. So this will take practice. So I suggest, taking the suggestions from earlier from Eugene that you are practicing with somebody else, and hopefully you're also practicing thinking out loud and speaking about what you're doing as you're going along and doing it. And this also ties into this next part ties into the first part, because it's okay to ask for guidance in interviews, especially if you come up with something and you're completely blocked. Your natural instinct might be to just shut down and say, I failed this interview. You're better off asking your interviewer for help or guidance. Again, this applies to both coding interviews and design interviews or any other type of technical interview question. Request guidance, stay on track. There may be some points deducted for how much help you're receiving, but in general, asking questions, requesting guidance is a good place to start. So I would highly recommend when you get into a state where you're stuck, just come back to this. Seek hints, request guidance. Debug thoroughly. This is an important one. Now, especially when you're doing coding interviews, you might be doing it on just a notepad versus you're doing it on a platform where you're able to execute code. Regardless of what you're doing there, my biggest tip here is if you find your own mistake or a bug that you have in your code, it's not going to get counted against you. So it pays to be very thorough, identifying errors, correcting any mistakes. The other thing I'll say here is really important as well, and it ties into just speaking through what you're doing, is if you're doing a coding interview like on a notepad, at the end, practice walking through specific examples. If you have take an array and do this, walk through an example. Here's a sample array. There's 4, 2, 5. There's 3 numbers in this array, and step through your code. You'll likely find issues in your code doing that. And you'll also be helping and demonstrating to the interviewer that this person is thorough and they can walk through their own logic and they understand what they just wrote. So very helpful. Last but not least, demonstrating confidence, eye contact. If you need to, put a sticky note on your webcam. Look here. Even if it's a remote interview, you can make your interviewer feel connected to you. Engaging interviewer is part of that confidence. You're asking questions. And this one, obviously, it's okay. Like, to me, I like to think I'm looking away. That's just natural to me when I am speaking to somebody, even face to face. But it's even more awkward during an interview. Obviously, you do you a little bit. Just be aware that what things help and what things can hurt you when you are doing some of those things.
The biggest shift in my interview experience was when I changed my mindset to not think about interviews as an interrogative experience and think of them as a collaborative experience. In other words, when I first started interviewing as an early career, I always thought about going to an interview with a sense of dread. The interviewer is going to ask me questions and I'm going to have to answer them, and it's going to be super scary. And I had some spectacular fails early on because of that kind of attitude. Because basically, as soon as I felt myself unable to answer the question, I would just shut down. Okay, I failed. But when I managed to switch my point of view to a collaborative experience, in other words, the interviewer is not asking me questions. We are solving a problem together. As soon as I managed to shift my mindset to that, now I can start asking for clarifying questions. Now I can start asking for hints if I'm stuck. Like, now we can engage in a more brainstorming type collaborative interaction. And that is way more positive, believe me, for the hiring manager too. Way more positive of an experience. As an interviewer, I hate just sitting there and like having to fire questions at the candidate and try to drag information out of them. That's no fun for me. And it's not going to create very good interview feedback either. Now, if the candidate can engage me in a collaborative conversation, That's way better.
I just like to remember that taking a mindset as you go into an interview of understanding, look, it's not just about how rapid or how effective you are at writing code. That's one aspect of it. But engineering managers want to understand your thinking process. How do you approach problems? How do you tear them apart? How do you make yourself the owner of these problems? How would you be to be a teammate, people that the hiring manager is working? They need to evaluate that. And I would argue that's even more important than superb skills on the coding front. And one other thought, this is also building a relationship. I knew some people who have had very good interviews and didn't get the job, but ended up getting called back by that same hiring manager because the interviews were fun and engaging and useful. And they found jobs at other parts of the company, made referrals. People actually got that work, which is really great. So it's your opportunity to shine and be a human, not a chat GPT.
Since you mentioned confidence, though, I think this actually makes a big difference. I wouldn't underestimate confidence. So when someone speaks confidently, you tend to trust what they're saying more. If someone, even if they're saying the right things, but they seem shaky or they're not sure themselves, you tend to just agree with them and doubt them. So having that confidence, I think, is also huge. That one thing I tell people is you are already doing that job. You work at this company, you've been doing this job for a while. The product, the customer, answer from that point of view. Don't be a complete outsider, someone who's a complete newbie. Just in your mindset, you should already put yourself in that position. And instead of being grilled, you are someone who their experience is being sought after by the interview. And I think changing that perspective makes a huge difference. Finally, when we talk about eye contact and just your body language, that also makes a big difference. One thing that really helps is recording yourself, seeing what it's like when you're being seen, especially through a virtual lens. And when I did this, I realized that when I think, I usually look up to the left and then everyone gets to look up my nose. It's not very good. It's not flattering. And I try to stop doing that. I used to have a sticky note that says look down in the place I used to look when I think. So now I still think. I just try not to look so far away and tilt my head up. So it's just something I didn't realize I was doing. But if you record yourself during an interview, especially if you could do that, if that's okay with the interviewer, but just even you answering questions by yourself, you'll see what you look like, and having positive body language affects your mindset and goes along.
Yeah, just remember that if you are recording during an interview, you do need to get interviewer's permission because most states are two-party consent states. So if you're recording without their knowledge, you're actually, other than the fact that the company may find, if the company finds out, that would be a problem, you are actually breaking the law. But there are also a lot of good AI-based tools that can help you with this as well. For example, there is a tool called Poised, and I know there's a bunch of others that let you record yourself and provide you even real-time feedback on, for example, your filler words like your ums and your likes and so on, the degree of confidence, the degree of energy you're speaking with. So it's great to use those kind of tools to practice your delivery and get it as effective as possible. You need to have a story bank. That is the first and most important thing that's really important to create when you go into an interview. And actually, Amazon, for example, recommends having 10 to 15 stories. So these are incidents from your experience that speak to potentially multiple different interview questions. As George mentioned, a question like, tell me about a time when you went above and beyond to deliver a project on time. Tell me about a time when you disagreed with your manager. Tell me about a time when you did something you were not expected to do to bring a project back on track, so on and so forth. So the point is the same story can work for multiple questions, depending on how you talk about what you did. And we'll talk about that in a second. But you also don't want to repeat the same story in a single interview. In other words, if you told this story to person A, do not tell the same story to person B, right? Choose a different story. So that's why having 10 to 15 stories that you can easily adapt to different questions is super, super important. I've had interviewees actually come to my interviews with a printed out cheat sheet, right, of their story bank. And when I ask them a question, a behavioral question, they'll say, give me a second. And they'll open their cheat sheet and they'll actually look at, it's not the full story that's recorded there. It's just like one page with story headings, but that can be a really great way to remember what your story bank is. And then once you have the story heading, you should know the story enough to be able to tell it all the way through without having to remember details and without getting fuzzy on details. So that's super important. In terms of story delivery itself, the best way to do this is to use the STAR format. That's the situation, task, action, result. And situation is essentially context. And that often, like, it's going to be very brief, and it's often going to be in the form of 6 months ago when I was working at Acme Corp, we were working on financial recording software, and I was asked to implement a feature to be able to import like financial records from QuickBooks, for example. That's it. That's your situation. And that's actually also your task. I was asked to implement the feature. That's the task. The bulk of the story, like 80% of it, is going to be focused on action, which is what are the exact things that you did for this story. I scheduled a meeting with these people. I convinced them to go this route rather than that route. I implemented the following set of, I created a design document. I implemented the majority of the feature, etc., etc., etc. Whatever your role was, as applicable to the task that you had mentioned, those are the actions you took. And those are the actions that you can adapt a little bit depending on the question being asked. Usually a story is going to have actions that pertain to multiple different questions. So if a question is asked, for example, tell me about a time when you really grew a junior developer, when you helped a junior developer grow. Let's take that financial records story as an example. You could really focus on, and I really worked with Bob. He was my colleague on the story. I really worked with him and did a lot of his code reviews, and I helped him with the design doc that he was creating and so on and so forth. So you would focus on that. But if the question was, tell me about the time you went above and beyond, you might not even mention Bob. You might talk about a different part of what you did within that story that answers that question. Hopefully that makes sense. And then the final thing is you really want to focus on metrics-based results. So it's not sufficient to just say, we delivered the story or we delivered the feature. No, we delivered the feature 10% before the deadline, or we increased customer, like this, with the delivery of this feature, we increased customer NPS scores from 7 to 9, or this thing that I developed decreased the time to deploy in our CI/CD pipeline from 4 hours to 2 hours. So basically you want to have specific metrics in your results, and the results are super important. That's the icing on your cake. That is the outcome that you, the hero of the story, have achieved. So make sure that you have those results. I've had the candidates who I've had to drag those results out of. Like they'll talk about all the actions they did, then they just peter out. And then I have to go, so what happened? And don't make me do that. Just tell me what the result was. It's way more effective. So let me turn it over to the panel now. What do you guys think?
I think just like anything else we've talked and spoken about so far in interviewing, practice. None of this comes naturally to anybody. Nobody ever told me I was a natural interviewer. It took practice, and I'm sure a similar kind of example in this group. So don't think if you feel somebody is better than you at something, especially when it comes to interviewing, it's not something that came naturally to them.
When you practice this really well, you often can adapt a story on the fly, because sometimes interviewers will throw questions that you don't expect at you. So really know these well. But what if you do get asked a question that you don't know? I always say, take a moment, breathe. Interviews are, people get nervous during interviews. It's normal, but buy yourself a little bit of time. We talked about asking clarifying questions. You could do this for behavioral questions. Often they're very ambiguous. Tell me about achievement you're proud of. If you're freeze, if you're not prepared for that, you can say, do you mean professionally, right? Because I'm really proud of a lot of personal achievements also. So that puts you in a good light. You achieve a lot of personal things in your life, but it gives you a little bit of time to just get that yes from the interviewer. Of course, it's going to be an obvious yes, but it gives you time to think. Also, take down some notes. I'm a visual person. I don't have a great memory, so I take a lot of notes. And I say this up front. When I'm asked a question that I just need to think through, I'll say, great question. Can I just get 30 seconds? I try to think before I talk. I'm just going to take a few notes and be very genuine. Spend 30 seconds, write down just a few words in the order that you want to say it, put it in whatever order you want, and then don't read from your note. Look at the camera and answer genuinely. You'll be amazed at how much those 30 seconds really help in formulating your thoughts. A lot of people, when they answer a question, they'll start down a path and then they'll go back and remember something that's really important to the context. And they'll say, oh yeah, wait. Because your interviewer is also taking notes, and the less they have to go back and change their notes, the easier their notes are going to be, and it just flows really well. So think before, give a thoughtful answer that's chronological, that just makes sense. But also, I'd really caution against reading, because it's so easy to Google something or use ChatGPT. So if you're reading line by line, that's a dead giveaway that even if you're not cheating, it just looks like you are. So don't do that, but do whatever worked for you. If you like paper and pen, use that instead, and they can see you writing on. Finally, I'd also say being ready with material is great. I had someone interview at Amazon once who came in with a piece of paper printed out with Amazon's leadership principles. And this gentleman had notes after every one about how he exemplifies each one of these principles. I didn't listen to all of them, but that was so impressive that he prepared so much for this interview. We ended up hiring him, not just because of that, but he did really great in the interview. But that just showed that he cared, he was dedicated, he worked hard just for this one interview and made a big difference. So those are additional tips that I would give. Now, let's talk about the flip side. What's it like from a hiring manager's perspective? I've been a manager over 10 years in the tech industry. I've done over 1,000 interviews, hired over 100 people. I've been through it a lot. And there's definitely some pain, especially now. We've talked about how the market's flooded. So many resumes. The average job opening in multiple different industries gets about 250 applicants. And that was a few years ago. So in tech, it's even more. And now it's even more. So hiring managers got a stack of resumes to look through. Can't possibly go through all of them. We have to use a lot of criteria to just filter through them. But even then, it's a pain. And resumes come in all different shapes and sizes. They don't always represent who the candidate really is. So that's just the first step. And then comes the interview. And finally, through the funnel, it's not just the resume, but going through screens and then on-site. Very few candidates actually reach the final stage or get an offer. So I think on average, it's about 72 to 1. So 72 applicants to 1 offer. That's approximately the ratio. I think there's a funnel on the next slide. But there's a lot of data around this. It's a few years old, almost 2 months to fill a software engineering role in the US and Canada. 40 candidates, qualified candidates apply. Again, this was a few years ago, so it's even higher now. And the amount of time that it takes to interview one candidate to get that hire, an average of about 13 interviews, and this is average. Even if every one of those interviews was an hour, which it's not, I would say 13 hours to spend with one person to make such an important decision is still not enough. And then retention. So even if you go through this interview process, you send out an offer, the retention rates are still not great. There's mishires that happen. People get through or people get in and then they realize, yeah, this is just not working out for them. This is not what I thought it was going to be for whatever reason. Referrals, however, these are the standout hero in this story. Referrals they do so much better. The one statistic that I like about referrals is they're 350% less likely to get terminated. Why are referrals so much better? I think it's simple, it's obvious. It's because they're known. It's someone who you know, someone who's been referred. So it's that personal experience with a person that makes referrals so much better because a candidate presents one side in their resume, one side during interviews, but how they do on the job could be slightly different. So even with referrals, they only make up 7% of all applicants. It's still not great. It doesn't make hiring so much easier, although it does help. Finally, the high cost of the risk of making a mishire. So there was a study done that the author of Top Grading, Dr. Bradford Smart, he is smart, he did some research and found that the cost to replace someone who is mishired, so someone who's hired, but they're not a good fit for the role, it is 5 to 27 times annual salary. So if you hire someone who makes 100,000, at minimum, you're spending $500,000 to replace that person. That is opportunity cost, lost time spent in recruiting, interviewing again. It is just enormous. Such an important decision left up to just a few hours with a person really is extremely high risk. So all of these together point to just a broken. We've been doing this for so long. Companies spend a lot of effort into making their interview process rigorous, meticulous, based on data. Like Amazon did this really well. I learned how to interview a lot at Amazon, and still there was mishires. It's not perfect. And so we thought, okay, is there a better way? How do we make hiring a better experience for the candidate, a better experience for hiring managers, take the risk out of this huge decision that is extremely high cost to make a risky decision on? And we think we've come up with a really good solution. At IncrediHire, we pre-vet candidates. So we take candidates through a 6-week real-world program. They work on a real product, they ship the feature, and they work in a team. It simulates exactly what they would do on the job. And during that time, we work with them, we mentor, we help them deal with real world situations to be prepared to be successful on the job. We give them interview training. update their resumes. We really help them to really get that job and be successful at the job that they want. And we give them a performance evaluation at the end. And so what a hiring manager gets is an entire portfolio of work. It's like hiring an intern that used to work at that company, where you can talk to their previous manager, peer feedback, you see the work that they did. It's so much more than a resume, than 13 hours of interviews, right? It's what the person actually does on the job. And finally, the candidates that go through our program, we don't leave them once they're hired. We give them 90 days of career coaching. And those first 90 days, they are absolutely critical to be successful in any job. You're making first impressions, you are building your reputation, building trust. So that's a make it or break it period. If you can get through the first 90 days, high chances you're going to be very successful in that role. For candidates, though, I want to stress we do simulate a real team. You get to work with others. It's not a personal project. It's not a project with just one or two other students in school or capstone project. It's a real world. You're going to have to deal with deadlines. You're going to have to deal with collaborating with others, making decisions, prioritization. And these are the things that we assess your skills at and help you through. And finally, one thing that really differentiates us is how we partner with hiring companies. So the biggest advantage, I would say, is that graduates from our program are guaranteed interviews. We partner with hiring companies and we tell them, we're going to give you this portfolio. We're going to deliver high quality vetted candidate. And then for candidates who complete our program, we are matchmakers. We're the Tinder, Bumble of hiring. That doesn't sound right, but we really try to match you with the job that you deserve based on your skills and what you put into the program.